shadow in the Himalayas. High in the Himalayas, tucked away between towering peaks, lies a small village in Nepal that few outside the country have ever heard of. The village, called Dhalka, is remote, accessible only by foot or mule, and isolated from the world. The villagers lived simple lives, relying on farming and prayers to the ancient gods for protection. But there's one thing every villager knows: you never, ever go near the old temple after dark. Growing up in Dhalka, Arun had heard the stories 1,000 times. His grandfather, like every elder in the village, warned him about the temple of Kalbhairav, a crumbling stone structure perched on a cliff overlooking the valley. It had been abandoned for centuries, and it was said to be haunted by something far worse than spirits. The locals called it the Chaya, the shadow that walks. According to legend, the temple was once used for sacrifices to Kalbhairav, the fierce manifestation of Shiva, meant to protect the village from evil. But something had gone wrong. A high priest, consumed by power, had attempted to summon a spirit too powerful to control. What came through the ritual wasn't a guardian, but a curse. A dark entity, half man, half shadow, began to haunt the village, appearing at the temple on the nights of the new moon, and anyone who saw it never returned. One cold winter evening, while gathering wood near the edge of the forest, Arun's curiosity got the better of him. He had heard whispers from other young men about daring each other to go near the temple, to prove the legend was just a myth. Arun, now 19, wasn't afraid of stories from old men, and he wanted to prove himself braver than his friends. They laughed about the warnings, calling it just an old tale meant to keep kids in line. But that night, with the moon gone and the stars barely visible through the fog, Arun felt a strange pull toward the temple. Ignoring the warnings that echoed in his mind, he grabbed a torch and made his way through the winding path leading up to the cliff. The wind howled around him, carrying the sounds of distant prayer flags flapping, and the deeper he went, the more the silence swallowed him. By the time Arun reached the temple, the air felt thick, oppressive. The stone steps leading to the entrance were cracked and overgrown with vines. The temple doors hung open slightly, creaking as the wind passed through. Inside, it was pitch black, save for the dim light of his torch. The scent of incense, ancient and faint, still clung to the air. Arun stepped forward cautiously, trying to ignore the cold dread creeping up his spine. He called out, half joking, half nervous, "Is anyone there?" For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from deep within the temple, came a soft whisper. "Leave." Arun froze. His heart pounded in his chest. He looked around, his torch shaking in his hand. It had to be the wind, he told himself. The wind and the old stones. But then he heard it again, louder this time, "Leave." Now the voice didn't sound human. It was low, raspy, and seemed to come from all directions at once. Arun's pulse raced, but his pride kept him rooted to the spot. He turned toward the inner sanctum of the temple, the place where the sacrifices had once been made. As he approached, his torch flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. That's when he saw it, a figure, crouched in the corner. It was humanoid, but not quite. Its body seemed to blend into the darkness, shifting, as if made of smoke and shadow. It stood unnaturally still, but its eyes, two pinpoints of glowing red, stared directly at Arun. Panic surged through him. He stumbled back, dropping the torch, which sputtered and went out. For a moment, everything was plunged into total darkness, and the air turned freezing cold. He fumbled for his flashlight, flicking it on just in time to see the shadowy figure moving toward him. Not walking, gliding. It didn't make a sound. The air around it seemed to warp, and as it moved, Arun felt an overwhelming sense of despair and fear, like the weight of centuries pressing down on him. He turned and ran. The climb down the cliff was a blur. Arun's lungs burned, his heart racing, but he didn't stop until he was back in the village, pounding on his grandfather's door. When the door opened, his grandfather took one look at Arun's pale, terrified face and knew what had happened. "You saw it, didn't you?" his grandfather whispered. Arun could only nod. The elders gathered that night, performing prayers and rituals to cleanse Arun of the shadow's curse. But something had changed in him. He was never the same after that night. He spoke little, and every month, as the new moon approached, Arun would fall into a deep, restless sleep, murmuring in a language no one could understand. Years later, another young man from the village would tell a similar story. He, too, had been dared to go to the temple, and he, too, had seen the shadow. But unlike Arun, he did not make it back. The villagers know now that the Chaya is real, and it still waits at the temple for those foolish enough to trespass. The legend says the shadow is bound to the temple, unable to leave, but each time someone sees it, they bring a little of its darkness back with them. So, if you ever find yourself in the mountains of Nepal, and you come across an ancient, abandoned temple, remember this: some things are better left undisturbed. Because once you've seen the shadow, it never really lets you go.